You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRMArchaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRMArchaeology Podcast, episode 270 for August 9th, 2023. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about writing proposals. What are they? What can you do to maybe win? And what should you not do? So get ready to work for free because the CRMArchaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Heather in her kitchen in Southern California.
Hi, everyone.
And Doug with child in Scotland.
I know. Yep, that's
we
Isla.
can hear.
And hello, everyone.
Right on cue.
Right on cue, exactly.
Yeah, she's better than her sister. She actually does this on a timely manner. We'll have to have her do the outro, Chris, so that it's all lined up on time.
Well, yeah, anything to be better than you, Doug. So,
right. Yeah, and Bill, I don't know what his life story is, but he was in St. Croix last time we recorded, and now he's in the Netherlands. He's gone back there. He's gone back to Denmark, and now he's in the Netherlands. I was like, "Are you moving there, Bill?" I don't know what's happening, but yeah, he likes it over there. And then Andrew's in Hawaii, I'm pretty sure, unless he's coming back today. So we're literally spread across the world right now. But I'm glad that three could join. And I mentioned backgrounds, and anybody who hasn't seen my RV, this is the side of it, if you're looking at on YouTube. If you don't know what I'm talking about, head over to the Archaeology Podcast Network on YouTube, and you can see our YouTube channel. We're starting to put everything up there, and this is the second episode we're recording with video on. Doug doesn't have a camera available, so it's Heather and I on the video today, but we are starting to do this more and more just to have more engagement over there on that platform, because that's where a lot of people listen to podcasts and watch shows. It's a very popular place to do that, so we may as well embrace it. So okay, well, Heather, it was your topic today, and it's a topic that can be a sore subject for a lot of young, new firm owners and people getting into the business, but also people who have been doing this forever. So what are we talking about today?
We are talking about proposals. I actually think that proposals and understanding how to write proposals, even if you've never written a proposal, you don't want to write a proposal, no ambition to write a proposal. Yeah. I think that understanding the process helps at any level, helps a archaeologist and CRM at any level, because it helps you understand the process. It helps you understand why budgets are important, why sometimes there might be more wiggle room in the fields than there is in the lab, or vice versa. I think maybe, at least for me, when I was beginning, it was a bit of a puzzle to understand, why do we do this a phase one way? Yeah. And then we do a phase one a different way, right? For the next project. And it can be confusing. So I thought just going through that process might be a good idea.
And just setting the stage here, because we're talking about, you've got some stuff in the notes here, like defining an RFP. I think we should even step back a little further. RFP is request for proposal, but you also see RFQs out there, request for quote. Yes. It really just kind of depends on who's setting it out, to be honest with you. And they can be different things.
And there's, I would say probably 70%, 60% of the proposals that I write have no RFP or RFQ. Mm-hmm. It's just the client saying, I need something. I have no idea what I need. And what is the process to make sure that you are doing your due diligence, make sure you're uncovering everything in the proposal that the client needs.
Right. So in that case, then we're really talking about, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, because trust me, you've done a lot more of these than I have in the past, but the major differences I see between certain proposals, like formally requested ones through, say, an agency, and an existing client you may have that's just like, hey, I need a proposal for this new project. Some of the major differences I see there is, one of them, you probably have a templatized format that you guys use, and you send it out saying, this is what we're going to do, this is how much it's going to cost, and this is when we expect to get it done. But agency proposals often have a very predefined format that you have to use, with predefined sections, and I need this, it can't be more than 10 pages sometimes, it's got to be these, and all that other stuff. Those are the big differences I see. Do you see anything else different starting that?
I think, you brought up a really good point. The difference between what we call an RFP and an RFQ. And we should probably provide definitions. So an RFP is request for proposals. RFQ is request for qualifications. I heard you, did you call it request for quotes? There may be other, acronyms, and it just also probably depends on the agencies that you're working with and the area of the country or the world that you're working in.
Mm-hmm.
But, they're all similar. So a request for proposal is when, like you said, an agency comes to you. And a lot of times private clients do that too. Clients, they're a little bit more savvy. They have an attorney on staff. They have counsel that they want to make sure that everything is covered. They want to control the work a little bit more than just the, an average client. And then a request for qualification is a little different. That's when you are presenting your qualifications that you can do the work and you're going to do it well. And there's various different agencies that put that out first. There's a reason for that. They have requirements that they have to fulfill. Many times federal agencies where they have quotas and things that they have to fulfill. So that request for qualifications is the first step. Then after that, they take the people that they select, that they consider qualified, and then they send an RFP from there. And then you work off that RFP. Then you have projects where they want the scope, but they don't want the cost yet, or they want the scope and the costs are delivered separately. So a decision is made based on your scope and whether or not they believe that you're going to be able to follow through with everything that you're saying you're going to. And number two, they're also looking at making sure that you followed all the directions and that you did present everything in your scope that they were asking for. And then based on that, then they look at the cost. So the decision is made solely on the proposal.
Yeah. And I have heard, unless you're a well-known company to the agency, you have a really good, well-developed relationship. Like if you just miss something stupid in the proposal that they required, they're probably not going to ding you for that too much. But if you're relatively new and they don't really know you that well and you haven't done a lot of projects, I mean, I've heard that if you don't get exactly right what they're asking for, you're missing something that you're turning in, you're out because they received 800 other proposals and they don't have time for you.
I think some people, to be candid, I believe that there are many times that the decision makers have one company they want to use.
Right.
And the fact that you're not following the directions is just, if you miss one little thing, it's an excuse not to select you.
I mean, again, I'm a really small company and I've done a number of proposals and I've always heard the ratio is about 10-1 for, relatively new companies where you'll win one proposal for every 10 you send out. And the ratio might even be less than that. Now, if you've got a well-established relationship, and you've got things going on, then it might be a little bit higher. But, for those, I mean, you're just turning in a lot of proposals. And like you said, a lot of times, they're required, especially the agencies, they're required to send out a request because that's their public due diligence, right? They have to do that. Right. But they are just like probably hoping with crossed fingers that a couple firms that they've worked with in the past actually submit, and they're more than likely going to get it. But they also have a responsibility to the public to get it at the cheapest price. So you can win if you come in underneath, but then that brings up the whole thought of lowballing and the reason nobody gets paid very well. And it just brings the whole industry down. Or
you lowball with the idea that you're going to have a contract amendment. And so that's also the fear on the side of, and, your relationship that you have and what you've established with that client, agency or private, helps them understand that you don't do that. But there's a lot of companies, obviously, that lowball, and there's people that are making decisions that maybe aren't as savvy, and they go with the lowball offer. And almost every time it comes up where there's contract amendments and it ends up being more expensive in the long run. Or it can be more expensive if the company that lowballed is less experienced. And I'll tell you, there's been several, a decent amount of our work is cleaning up other people's messes. So think about it. You've already paid another company to do the work, and now you have to have somebody else come in and do the work all over again, or try to come and fix what they can, You
guys sort of mentioned a preferred person. I would say, especially when you have private sector, there's not necessarily a preferred candidate as preferred candidates, in that they'll be happy, they'll know the work of several people, and that's usually when they go out for a sort of private tender, as Heather was saying, and I would say there's not necessarily like there's always just the one. Some of them will be like, yeah, we're happy with a couple of these people if they got it.
Both. Yeah, I hope it happens both ways. I mean, I know for certain there's, I'm just like in my mind right now, I can think of an entity or an organization that wants one group. That's it. And, it's just gotten to the point where you don't even propose anymore. And that's another thing we can talk about. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think in this first segment, I do want to talk about the different types of things that you could expect us to do as a proposal. And one thing that's coming to my mind that I actually had quite a bit of success with is an IDIQ. And that is getting onto a 5-year plan, basically, with an agency, often a military base or something like that. And, in those circumstances, now IDIQ means, correct me if I'm wrong, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. So basically, you're just saying, here's our qualifications. You're usually under a prime contractor, and they have subs that work, different areas. And the subs basically submit to the prime, and they submit the whole package. And it's basically, here's what I can do this for. And one of the things that, oh my God, the China Lake project I worked on, that was under an IDIQ, I believe. But basically, we had to submit a table without knowing what could happen in the next 5 years. We had to submit a table that said, if we do a project of small, medium, or large size, however they define that, and they had definitions, this is what it's going to cost us. And then they have like 5 companies that won the IDIQ. And when they have a new project within their area, they just look and see who's going to do it the cheapest of those 5 companies, and you get it. There's no proposal. There's no anything. That's how it worked. That is incredibly stressful, because if you misjudge something and you end up having to do it cheaper than it is, you can't even submit an amendment in most cases. You just have to do it. Yeah.
There's a lot of proposals. Boy, we could go into the weeds on this, but I'll just say this much, that I think smaller companies, it's a little different, because there's federal agencies have a requirement for a certain amount of a DBE, disadvantaged business enterprise. Yeah. And so a company like ours that's moderately big or a moderately sized company do not qualify for those. And so either we have to bring somebody in, as a vendor, as a subcontractor, or we just don't go after them. And so I think as a small business, and a lot of times the small businesses, that's all they go after, are those ones that are required to have DBEs. We have agencies that have a 5-year contract with us. We have to set just exactly what you're saying. We have to not necessarily say this is how much each task is going to cost, but we give them our billing rates. Yeah. And we have them stratified based on, the years that the contract covers. And then we have to stick to it. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, talk about challenging, especially, what if there's a global pandemic during one of those years? How does that change things? Right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's take a break. And then on the other side, we'll come back and dive into these proposals a little more and actually writing one. Back in a minute.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
College Savings Iowa is now iSave 529, and it can do more than take your child to college. It's their passport to a bright future because funds can be used for K-12 tuition, trade schools, graduate degrees, books, and everything they need to get anywhere they want to go. Register by September 30th at iowa529contest.com for a chance to win a $5,290 contribution. iSave 529 for every child, for any adventure.
Welcome back to episode 270 of the CRM Archaeology podcast. And we are talking about writing proposals, basically, and the different types of proposals. But now I think we're, unless we got more to talk about there, we should just get into actually putting these things together.
Let's look at, maybe just go down the road of an RFP. How do you create a proposal from an RFP? So we alluded to the fact that it is important to look at all the details. Sometimes, and you kind of get your feel for it, you understand which agencies are pickier than others. But it is important as a rule to follow the RFP. Page length, resumes, how long the resumes should be. Are the resumes counted in the page length? Now, I'm fortunate that we have a publications department that pretty much they go through the whole RFP and they do all those types of things. They make, marks for that. And if it's a larger RFP, they write quite a bit of it with the boilerplate that we have. But then when it comes to scope for specific tasks, then to me, I actually like it. I think it's probably a little crazy, but I enjoy it because this is where you get to be creative. This is where you get to not only show that you read the RFP, you understand what they need, but also you can say, okay, you know what? Very respectfully, I don't think you need this and this is why. Or I think that if we go down, maybe this is a different avenue that you want to, as far as the task goes, this is a different approach. And this is why we believe this is the case. And we've won projects just on that, thinking outside the box, and especially when it's a cost saving measure. And if it's not a cost saving measure, it's going to cost more. Why in the long run they want to do this? Why is this going to increase the defensibility of the work that you're doing? Why is this essential if you're going to add a task? So that creativity, I really enjoy that. I know for some, they don't enjoy it, but I think that to me, not only following the rules, but at the same time, finding that balance between following the rules and customizing the proposal is essential to winning.
How do you guys deal with proposals that say, well, they require maybe specific things, right? I'm thinking of one in particular that I lost to a company, Logan Simpson. In fact, I've talked about this on the radio, on the air before. I don't care if they know, but I'm so pissed. No, it was a project right in my backyard, basically, and we didn't win it. And we didn't win it by just a narrow margin, because you can talk to the agency and say, why didn't we win this, right?
Yes.
I mean, they have to tell you that. Yeah. So. And we didn't win it because they said that there was a bunch of remote areas and ATVs would likely be required to access some of these areas. And I was like, great, we have a place in town we can rent ATVs from. We can tow it with our truck. And if we win this, we'll get those ATVs. Well, Logan Simpson said they have ATVs and they'll use them. So the agency was like, okay, well, they don't have to rent them. And, because what if you can't rent them? And what if something's going on? And that's literally why we lost the project. Yeah. That's it. And I was so mad. How do you deal with stuff that's a requirement that you don't have?
I would actually venture to say they may not have even had ATVs.
Exactly.
But they're saying they have access to ATVs, just like you have access to ATVs. And they were getting a little, creative with their verbiage. Right. But did you learn something from that?
I did. Be creative with my verbiage. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
That's actually what I was going to talk about, being creative with your verbiage. And not actually being creative, but it's a weird thing. As you do more and more proposals, you'll find out, and it's almost like a crapshoot, because what you're looking at is it's the people who are evaluating that. And if you know them, you might know what they're looking for. But if you don't, it could be, so, you've just mentioned things of like, oh, you're supposed to have that. And that's how you lost the contract. I've gone through other projects where it's like, oh, these are must-haves. And actually, they didn't turn out to be must-haves at all. I think I've heard someone describe it as like fly fishing, and that like each time you're throwing out a different sort of lure, hoping that it works and the fish bite. Sometimes it doesn't work, because sometimes you could be super detailed. And probably that's actually what happened to you, Chris. You were probably detailed and said where exactly you're going to get your ATVs.
Right.
And possibly Logan Simpson just said, we will source ATVs, or we have a source of ATVs, something very generic enough that they probably might be renting them. But the person who's reading that can only base hopefully they're only basing their decision off of what's presented. And like, it's a crazy thing. Like sometimes you provide too much detail and it costs you the project. Sometimes you don't provide enough detail and they're like, actually, we wanted minute by minute breakdown of all your times when you're going to set off and your work packages and all this stuff. So it's really tough. Sometimes being more vague helps you. Sometimes being more detailed helps you. And you start to get a feel, if you've dealt with the same organizations or people, what they're looking for. That can sometimes help you. But other times, roll the dice. You put out what you think it is there, and hopefully the person who's reviewing it reacts better to a detailed proposal if you put in a detailed proposal or detailed details. Yeah.
You can also hedge your bets. And, what I've done before is that I do more of that broad sense, unless, of course, the RFQ requests a more specific, right? But I think the really best bet is to go with what the RFQ requests and then put in verbiage in there. I love assumption verbiage. And I mean, assumptions are obviously essential, but it's more than just the typical assumptions. And then also putting verbiage in there that alluding to the fact that more details can be provided upon request, but not in that kind of just blanket way. But you say, okay, well, there is a much more complex, approach to this, which we will be happy to explain upon request type of thing. Sure. And so then that gives you that option to kind of say, hey, there's a lot more to this, especially when you have a page limit. Some of these page limits are insane. And, and the other thing is that you have to think about is that the people that are reading these, they don't want to read these, especially they really don't. Yeah. Especially if there's like 100 of these, and we've had proposals 150 pages long. It's insane. So they're looking, and they have people that go and vet them before they get to the next stage. Okay, did they get and that's where you can get kicked out before even the decision makers see it, is by the fact that the people that were vetting it before it got to them said they didn't follow this direction, that direction, you're gone.
I mean, this isn't any different than, crafting your CV and applying for a job. You're just doing it from a company standpoint. So you got to follow the rules. And then just like a CV, you got to tread the fine line of following the directions and giving them what they asked for and saying, yes, I do have a field school. I do have a degree, and I've got this relevant experience. Right. Same thing with proposals. We've got these qualifications. We have relevant experience in the area and or with the agency. And, here's our past performance. But you also have to tread the line of providing all those things, but also realizing, yes, they're humans that don't want to read any of this. So don't be too verbose, too descriptive, and too flowery with your language. Just give them the details and call it good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just looking at your notes here, let's talk about some of the potentially out of scope and things that you just can't anticipate. How do you build that in without saying, we may need all this extra money, because then you won't win the project?
Okay. So what you do is that you are very specific with your verbiage, so that maybe they don't, and this isn't pulling wool over anyone's eyes, but this is covering yourself. So you are very specific with the language. Like, I can't tell you, talk about thinking too much, but you have to. In this area, the devil's in the details. So you have to look at what is covered from a legal sense, what would be covered and what you're saying you're going to do. Yeah. And then you have assumptions. Now, you don't want to have 30 different assumptions for one task, right? But that's why writing your language is really important, that you do it in a concise and very accurate way, so that when, let's say, something happens, this is a very easy one. I think everybody uses it, where you say that, one of the assumptions is that no resources will be found, right? Yeah. So that's one example. No resources are going to be found. Why would you want to say that? You're going to say that because if a resource is found, now all of a sudden you have all these other things that you have to do to address that resource, that you don't want to go full-fledged and say, oh, okay, well, we're going to put everything in the proposal because we may find a resource. you do that and all of a sudden your number will knock you out before they even read it. So your budget will knock it out before you even read it. So just, those kinds of assumptions are important, and making sure that you're very specific with your language.
Yeah. The assumptions, for those that don't know what we're talking about, I even have those on some other contracts and proposals I put together for this software thing that I do. I mean, the assumptions can really save your ass, because you're not saying this and this and this is going to happen. You're just saying, hey, I'm literally assuming that this is going to happen. And if it doesn't, we're going to have a conversation about it, right? Like during the project.
Yeah, you finish it off in a nice way. You say, like if additional tasks are required, we'll be happy to, provide a supplemental scope and cost. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things to get across to people if you're starting out with this is actually this is usually, in most cases, forming part of your contract. It'll be legally binding. Gosh, there are so many different ways of doing contracts, and it may be one of the things where, depending on the project you're on, your proposal might be rewritten in a different contract, taking words out of it, saying you're delivering these things and stuff like that. But especially on small projects, and actually even like a lot of places now, it'll differ from country to country, but essentially even like a request for quote, that essentially those emails back and forth form a contract between you and the individual. So if you have something small like that and you're getting a request for quotes, always include a line about your terms and conditions. And like, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't have terms and conditions, get terms and conditions. Like, you need to have something that can form a contract that if your proposal goes forward, you don't necessarily want to include all those details about like, oh, we need to be paid on the 6th of the month and stuff like that. But you do want to have something like a terms and conditions that are included in even the smallest of quotes. Like if it, especially like this is definitely more a UK thing, but it's very small projects. Maybe like a watching brief would be a monitoring job for maybe like a day or half a day or something like that, where you just get a farmer who calls you up and is like, oh, I need to have this done. Can you do it? How much will it cost? And you send back a quick quote. That's basically your contract right there. It's forming a legally binding aspect. And if you're missing key parts of that, it'll be a huge pain later if something goes wrong. So yeah, if I could drive one point home for our listeners, or I guess viewers now as well, listeners/viewers, is that if you're going to start doing this, it's not something you could sort of slap together without any consideration, because you might be opening yourself up to a world of pain and some sloppy language of something like, I've seen it happen to companies where basically they've got on the hook for everything. They couldn't renegotiate anything because they'd put in some sloppy text because no one looked it over. And basically it was, they were going to do the project for that price and there was no renegotiation. It cost them a lot of money.
In the last few minutes of this segment, let's just talk about cost real quick here, because again, we talked about lowballing, and sometimes to position yourself with the agency, knowing that you're just trying to get your foot in the door, as long as you're not going to do that forever, that won't necessarily bring the industry down. But it's hard for small companies to make that adjustment. If they win, they want to do everything low so they can continue. And they are small. I guarantee you right now, if a company is owned by, say, one person and there's no board of directors, there's no human resources department, there's no anything like that, then I don't care how many projects they're doing and what you're getting paid. They're sweating payroll every single week. They are not driving a Bentley. They are not, living the high life. So how do we,
even a few owners,
well, yeah, for sure. How do we do this? How do we say, we try to bid the right amount, but we don't want to bid too much. We don't want to bid too little. How do you deal with that? I mean, a company your size might be able to, say, take a hit on a project because you might be able to afford it. Maybe bigger companies can, just to get your foot in the door, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I'm sure that happens a lot, to be honest.
Don't do it. Do not do that. I'll speak from experience. Like it's no, don't.
Yeah.
Because seriously, what happens is you think, oh, they'll get to know you and stuff like that. But literally, like, man, it's a huge thing in business. I've gone through training for this. Is part of what you do, I know this is gonna, like, it sucks when you're starting out, and this is the hardest thing to learn, is you can choose your clients. It doesn't feel like it. It won't feel like it especially when you're desperate and like, you've had no work and you've got no jobs and you really need something to keep the lights on, literally, in some cases. Mm-hmm. But you don't want those clients, because those clients have basically hired you because you're the cheapest, and they're always going to hire whoever's the cheapest. So you'll always lose out if someone is willing to go lower than you. And what you want as a client is someone, they'll definitely want value for money, but they'll want the value is the key part. So you want a client who can realize when they look at those things that we're not going to take that low ball that's half of everyone else's bid, because we know that they're going to fail and we're just going to have to redo everything again, as Heather was talking about earlier, how many contracts she gets from companies like that. And you want that, but you actually want a client who can realize that things cost money and it's better to do it right the first time and cheaper, and that's who you want. And so if you're always winning on being the cheapest, it's going to just cause you so much pain, because someone else is going to come in and there's no loyalty. And you prefer a client that has loyalty. Loyalty may not be the right word, but that's the client you want, is the one who will see that. So I would say at the very least, just it's going to be the hardest thing you're ever going to do, because you're going to look at it and looking at your bank account and seeing that negative balance, and you're very desperate for work.
I'll tell you, every time I drive my 33,000 pound RV over a new bridge, I think this was built by the lowest bidder. So
that's true.
Yeah, good.
We call it buying work, and I do agree with Doug. I do, but there are some instances where buying work is okay. One example is both companies are growing at the same time, right? You're entering into a different area together. So let's say one example might be drones, right? So you're doing some aerial work, LiDAR, and there's various different disciplines within a larger environmental company or medium size like ours, where drones are helpful. Your client needs that, and you don't yet have it. That's not our case, but you don't yet have it. It was our case at one point. So you don't yet have it. And so you have a client who's willing to give you, because based on the experience they have with you and the relationship they have with you, they believe you're going to do a good job. You're going to do right by them. And so maybe they purchase the equipment, and then your fees for labor are very low or nothing. Right. So you're growing together. So I do think in that instance, buying work is a good idea. I've seen buying work, but with a small company. And if you're doing it because you don't have any other work, that I agree with Doug is wrong. But if you're trying to get into a new market, buying work sometimes works.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, let's take our final break. And on the other side, we'll talk about what happens if you lose and or win the proposal. Well, not and. It's going to be one or the other. Let's talk about what happens in either case. Back in a minute.
Well, we got a minute. I'm going to buy that truck I've been wanting.
Wait, don't you need like weeks to shop for a car?
I don't. Carvana makes it super convenient to find exactly what I want.
Hold up. You're buying a car on your phone? Isn't that more of a laptop thing?
You can shop wherever you want.
I like to do my research, read reviews, compare models. Plus, Carvana has thousands of options. How'd you decide on that truck?
Because I like it.
Oh, that is a great reason.
Go to Carvana.com to sell your car the convenient way.
College Savings Iowa is now iSave 529, and it can do more than take your child to college. It's their passport to a bright future, because funds can be used for K-12 tuition, trade schools, graduate degrees, books, and everything they need to get anywhere they want to go. Register by September 30th at iowa529contest.com for a chance to win a $5,290 contribution. iSave 529, for every child, for any adventure.
Get everything for your next project at Menards and save big money. Enjoy a good night's sleep for less with a new Serta mattress. Shop today and save big. The better the mattress, the better the savings. Find the perfect mattress that fits your size and firmness needs at Menards. America's #1 home improvement retailer for customer satisfaction, according to J.D. Power. Visit jdpower.com for details and menards.com for deals.
Save big money at Menards.
Welcome back to episode 270 of the CRM Archaeology podcast. And we're talking about proposals, writing proposals, and how do you prepare them, and winning and losing proposals. So before we get into what happens if you do win or lose it, let's talk about cost, because we were talking about assumptions earlier. And, one of the biggest assumptions and obviously one of the biggest costs associated with a proposal is, will I find any sites? I mean, that's all tied up in a payroll. That's your biggest cost, but payroll's tied up into how long is it going to take, and how long is it going to take is tied up into how many sites am I going to find? And of course, you don't know how many you're going to find. You have to do some sort of, either you have familiarity with the area or some sort of preliminary lit search for free, basically, because you're not getting paid to do that. And you have to say, well, there's been a lot of stuff found in that valley next door, so I can probably assume there's going to be things found here. I think we're going to find maybe 30 sites, so I'm going to put that in my assumptions. But what are those sites worth? How do you figure that out? And how do you know if one's a two-flake lithic scatter and one is a mile-long mining site? How do you account for that? So let's hear it, Heather. How do you guys do that?
Well, I mean, I would say 80% of the proposals I write assume nothing's found, and almost the only time that there's an assumption that sites will be found is either if the RFP has that language in there, that they want you to scope for finding 3 sites, that kind of thing. Or if you're in an area that's sensitive and that's going to happen. And also you do have to judge your client. You have to judge, is including that going to make a difference in whether or not you're selected? So, there's so many things to think about. We have formulas that we believe each one of us has our own, because based on your region, like you can't say that. I've heard of companies say, okay, well, digging a 1x1 for data recovery costs this much money, period. Well, it's going to cost different on the coast in the sand than it would in the hard clay, right?
Sure.
If you assume that your excavation is going to be the same, no matter what your environment and what your type, the soils that you're dealing with, it's silly. So you really have to know your area. And so I base it on how many units. And a lot of times what this requires you to do is ahead of time kind of get a bit of a quasi research design in place. Let's say if you're doing, a data recovery, or you're thinking you might have to do an evaluation. So you have these costs ahead in your mind.
Well, and along those lines, I actually did lose a couple of projects to BLM Nevada and I talked to them. I was actually friends with a couple of agency people. So I was like just calling them up and say, hey, what's going on here? But I did lose a few because, I was and still am heavy into digital archaeology, right? And I understand the benefits of doing that right. I know how to do it right. And I know how to save actually a lot of money on the back end, which means a lot of time. And I actually lost a few projects because my bid was too low.
I was just lost one because they said your bid was too low. And I'm like, what?
Yeah. I know. So you have to say, even though you might be able to say, let's say you're not lowballing, you're just more efficient. That could happen, right? Let's say you're just better at the other people that are doing this. And you're saying, I'm more efficient and we can do this. And maybe you're a one person shop and you've got people, with you, and it's just, that's how you operate. Right. But you still have to be competitive, but you don't want to raise your rates up to be too high, of course, because then you'll lose it. But then you're like, and you don't know what low is. You don't know what the low is. I mean, you can maybe guess, but you don't know what that is. You don't know what their error bars are, because they are throwing out the low ones and they're throwing out the high ones and they're looking at everybody in the middle. So it's frustrating. It
is frustrating. I think that what you need to do when you're writing a proposal, and let's say you are going to be lower, and I felt in this one that we just lost, I asked why for some feedback. They said, you were too low. We believe that you didn't understand the level of work that would be required to get this accomplished.
Jeez.
Personally, like I can think about this and learn from it. I personally think that they had the fix in. They knew who they wanted, and this was just an excuse. But I do think that when even if you don't know, that you're going to be lower than others, having language in there that makes the potential client curious as to why your price is the way it is a really good way to hook them that other way. So you have a low price, and then you have language in there that explains and makes them wonder, oh, wait a minute, maybe they have a different approach here. They're not just trying to lowball us. Yeah.
They get scared by different too sometimes, right? Because I did start including like paragraphs of data about my digital recording methods. And because you always have to include methodology anyway, usually,
Yes.
I mean, sometimes, but I would include, here's how we're able to do things more efficiently. Here's all this, but sometimes they just don't buy that either. They want tried and true, and they want status quo. You know, they don't want to be the guinea pig.
Well, then maybe that's where you follow your own advice. Maybe they're not the client for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doug.
I would say this is sort of a pet peeve I have in archaeology. Is Chris? You were giving back all your efficiencies, and this is what archaeologists do. Like in other disciplines, other companies, you pretty much, even if you could do it cheaper, you still bid about the same. If you're winning work at that amount, you keep that. And if you could suddenly do it for a third cheaper, that third goes back into your pocket.
Sure. Yeah.
Whereas archaeologists instantly,
yeah.
Yes. And well, that's just it. Is like, and this goes back to our discussions about wages and archaeology and stuff. And efficiencies go to the company, and then they can go out. They could go to the, whoever the owner is, or they can go out to the labor. And, that's the system we work in. You may not like it, but it is the system we work in.
Yeah.
But that's just it. It's like instantly archaeologists are like, oh, well, we've discovered a way of doing this a lot cheaper. Take the example of like digital recording. And pretty much without a doubt, every archaeologist handed that money right back to their clients, as opposed to taking it, and with really low profit margins. And I know, again, we can't really jump into this in this shorter time, but you absolutely need a profit margin, or if you're a nonprofit, a surplus margin. And that's there for like, something bad happens and you need money. Or you need that money to invest, like investing in the next level of digital tech or whatever. And you can't do that without a surplus. And unfortunately, people are like, oh, 1% to 2%, that's just enough. Maybe 5% if we're feeling really adventurous in archaeology. And I swear to God, that's so many archaeologists are like that. And you're like, no, like a minimum, if we're talking budgets, something we haven't talked yet, is like, wherever you're putting in a budget, you need to have a surplus. And that's not a contingency. Yeah. That is a surplus. That is a profit. And you should be aiming for, I'd say, a minimum of 10%, if not more.
Yeah, and you're totally not wrong. And I definitely learned my lesson on that, right? Just like the ATVs, right? You learn through experience what to put in there. And like my last few projects that I did were pretty big. I had partners with these, and I had to, even though I was lower, and my long-term client I had for a decade, she just came up with these huge projects we had to do, and I needed to bring in help for it. And, we all divided and conquered. But in order to put together, pricing that they would understand, I actually had to raise my rates up to come up to the other guys, because they weren't nearly as low, but I was still making a profit. But because I had to raise my rates up, I was making a massive profit. And I was taking that, and I had really good wages. I had really good per diem. We went out to dinner every session, and my company paid for it. We just did all these fun things along with the project. But then again, like you're saying, Doug, and Heather, this too, even a small company, even if you're just one person, if you have payroll, even if that's only one person, you need to expect to have $20,000 to $30,000 in the bank, because you're not going to be able to pay them, because you're not going to get paid for that project until it's done in most cases. So you have to be able to cover that. So you do need the surplus, like Doug was saying.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I wanted to talk just a little bit about what, I know we've talked about it on the show before, but what goes in, what's the difference between an hourly and the billing rate?
Yes.
So
yeah, that's the biggest thing.
And also when we're looking at proposals, let's say we're looking at a site evaluation. Yeah. So a mid-level effort, and you have to anticipate, okay, how many excavations do I need to do? Sometimes it's already in the RFP. Sometimes that's something you have to create. And these are other things that, like Doug and Chris, you're saying about things that you're building in. Writing a proposal takes hours. Okay. That's time that you are expending, and that's something you're having to float. Now, sometimes if you're smart, you're writing these things up with the idea that they can be easily shifted into the actual report. A lot of this language can work that way, but it's still a lot of effort that you're not getting paid for. And that could just be for nothing, if you don't win. So let's look at, when we're looking at writing a proposal, it's not just about is how many excavation units we have to do. You have to look at, okay, so let's say we have 5 excavation units. How many would I anticipate? How many crew supervisors would I anticipate that I need? And how many archaeological technicians that are just going to be excavating? How many of those do I need? How much lab time do I need? And so it's not just a number. You are dividing this number up into how many hours for each person. So, I think sometimes people don't realize that when a company is hiring for an effort, they have only so many crew supervisor positions and only so many, project lead positions, maybe just one. And then you have this many labor positions. And so, people are like, well, how come I'm being hired no problem at $20 an hour, but then when I start getting bumped up and I'm making $30 an hour, how come I'm not getting hired as much? Because there's fewer roles for somebody that's getting paid at that rate. And it's not because the company is being cheap on you. It's because they already have those crew supervising positions are filled. What they need right now are more excavators. So, I think that is one thing to understand. Your billing rate is typically triple what you're paying the person. Sometimes it can be less, or sometimes it could be more depending on your billing rates. So billing rates are not an exact triple. Usually you have billing rates, and especially when you're writing proposals, sometimes companies, agencies will require that you give your set billing rates, your fee schedule. So you have to stick to those. And so people have to fit within those. You were going to say something, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, on the billing rate, I would say that the bigger the company, the higher the multiplier, right? So if you're getting paid $30 an hour and your billing rate is triple, that means they're charging $90 an hour for you. And a lot of people are like, well, where the hell is that other $60 going? And I was like, the bigger the company, the more non-billable people you have, right? Like you have HR, you have the safety department, you have, all kinds of different people. You have people checking your proposals. You can't charge that against a project in most cases.
You have overhead. So we just, our company, companies need to calculate overhead, your overhead percentage. I mean, that's required. And so, that's an eye opener when you think about that. It's also, you have buildings, you have property that larger companies have.
Taxes, insurance.
These are all things that are necessary. And so that triple, I would say 10% profit, like Doug was saying, and sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, but 10% profit is pretty much what a company gets after everything is said and done. So that triple multiplier is covering so much more than just, it's not just, $60 going into the pocket of the client, I mean, of the company. Doug?
Yeah, for sure. Doug.
Yeah, and also I think we should also mention that depending on the organization you work with, there could be multiple budgets. So you could have the project budget that you put together, and then depending on your company, you could have an internal budget. That could be very frustrating because a lot of times what will happen is, as we were mentioning, there's people on those higher overheads, those PIs, those project managers that they need to be able to find a place to charge their time. And sometimes they get internally will get dropped on your project. So you would have been perfectly on budget. You've got the perfect project. Everything works fine. And then suddenly, 2 days of project manager time is dropped on your budget. And it makes it look like you've gone over budget. And it can be quite frustrating to try to work those internal politics of an organization, because you're trying to prove that you can do a project on time, and there is a budget that just says no, you didn't do that. But it's not your fault. Right. It'll be an internal thing. But just to be aware that a lot of times you'll have two budgets, and one is what you put in your proposal, and the other one's the internal one, which may not line up, and that could be quite frustrating if you're new to that sort of situation.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Our company, and I think most companies or larger companies have a utilization expectation. So out of the 40 hours that you work, they expect you to bill 80%. Let's say that's a high utilization. That's more for somebody who is a laborer. And then you have management where your billability is lower than that, but then your billing rate is higher. And exactly what Doug is saying, although I don't typically have that issue, but I could see how that could happen. Why are we having managers that are at a higher billing rate and are, billing with a lower utilization when the laborers are expected to be, the technicians are expected to be at 100% utilization? How is that fair? But those are, the managers, many times, not all of them are created equal. Many of them are not. But a good manager knows how to bring the work in. And there's a difference between, we see this all the time where people are getting laid off in smaller companies. You have one person. That one person may have a really great connection with a few people, but they're only one person. The larger company that you have, the more connections that you have, and the more consistency of work that you have. And so those managers, if let's just assume that they're good managers, are worth their cost for sure, because they're the ones that are continuing to bring in money in clients and ensuring that everyone else still has work and isn't going to get laid off.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of bring us back to the whole idea of what Heather was saying is you're making assumptions about what you're going to find, and that's how you're putting together your budget. And then that budget is what goes out to the people reviewing. And for anyone listening to the podcast who are reviewing, not all those assumptions are always transparent to the people reviewing, because we have a lot of consultants who will be like, I put out, I got 3 tenders back, 2 were in the same ballpark, and 1 was just completely out there. And we're like, why did they even bother? Some of that is people are putting in tenders hoping not to get the work, but want to keep that relationship up with the client. But some of it is actually they've made some assumptions, and that's what they think it will cost, and it may very well cost that amount. It goes back to the sort of winning and losing. And I know we ended the last segment with Chris saying, there's only 2 things you could do: win and lose. I would say there's more, because there's winning, but in the long run, losing. Like there's just contracts on paper you've won, but really you've lost, and it's gonna hurt when you find stuff and you're under budget and you don't have the resources to do it, and that's coming out. And then there's losing, but in the long run, winning, in that you didn't get that project, but then that project ends up to being a hellscape, absolutely horrible, that would have ruined your life and taken 10 years off of it. So on paper they'll be winning and losing, but actually it's much later that you figure out if you've actually won or not. Indeed. And sometimes you don't.
I think sometimes you lose. I've had this happen too, where you're getting a lot of work from an agency and they don't want there to be a perception that the fix is in and that they're going to always use you. And so sometimes they actually know that they have another project that's coming up that they really think you as a company would do really great with, and they want you on that project. They may not select you for a project you're proposing on. And so you just cannot take it personally, but you always want to learn from it. And there's ways to do that, but you always want to learn from a loss and a win, but understand that it's business. You're not going to win everything you propose for. And honestly, like my team's always like, Heather, stop. We win a lot. Actually, we do. Our win percentage is very high. Yeah. It's because of the relationships that we have. But, sometimes on the team, they're like, Heather, can you stop proposing on projects? Because there's only so much you can do. And that's the other thing is that, when you have a good relationship with the client, you do not want to put that in jeopardy by just haphazardly proposing on everything. Right. You have to have some discipline. Otherwise, you are going to shortchange your good clients, and then where you're going to be.
Sure.
That's actually number one thing from consultants that come back is actually they wish people would just, instead of bidding and wasting everyone's time, they wish people would just come to them and say, listen, we're not in a position to do this project, or we don't think we can do it. If you need the 3 bids to get through whatever internal thing, we'll throw in one if you absolutely need it. But if not, we'd like to skip that one. And actually consultants and the people reviewing it much appreciate that. Yeah. But you have to have that, there's a lot of fear in archaeology, and a lot of people fear that if they're not bidding, then they're going to get passed up, or they're not going to get that opportunity next time. Like if they pass on not necessarily a public tender, but if someone came to them with a sort of private request, they always feel that they have the obligation to go forward with it. And sometimes that's not the best thing. And honesty definitely will help that relationship. And back to what Heather was saying also is like, yeah, talk to people who do these reviews and assign it. You'll find out like sometimes, especially for like smaller projects, they'll throw it to someone new.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not their normal people, because they want to sort of have a variety and they want to see how these new people are going to do, and they'll test them out on smaller projects. And you could have had a much better proposal. You could have been cheaper. You could everything could have been better, but it's not necessarily about that from the client's point of view. Or they're just wanting to, you know, test out. They have a lot of work and they're like, well, let's see how these people do, and maybe we can bump them up, and, you know, if they're quality, and it's testing out.
Mm-hmm.
There's other things, you know, federal contracts, you get the women-owned and minority-owned business points or veteran points. I'm not saying I actually think that's a good thing, but again, that's something that you can't always control. I've been on a project where there was two sections of it. We bidded for both. I think our bid was much better because we actually anticipated that the two parts would have to work together, but they weren't. The client wasn't willing to internally. They couldn't give both to one company, so they split it up. That project went sideways because the other company that got the other side of it hadn't actually anticipated working across the two aspects. And that, I think that was actually $10,000. I mean, that's not a lot of money, but you know, it was a fair chunk that just had to be instantly with the contract put out before the project even started. They had to redo the budget because they hadn't actually anticipated that, but they couldn't give that. We had, but they couldn't give us both aspects of the contract. So there's so many different ways you could lose a contract or win a contract. And I think that's, if I could end with, we're talking about learning experiences, but you really need to make sure you absolutely understand, because there's a tendency, if you won, to think that you're actually doing things right. And it may actually be you won, you were actually the worst option, but there were other mitigating factors that made sure that you got it.
Yeah.
I would recommend, if you win or lose a contract, always contact the people if they're willing to give feedback. Not everyone has the time or ability to, and get that feedback, because you shouldn't assume you've won it and that you should keep doing what you're doing, because it could have been a different aspect. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're getting into what we want to talk about next time, because we didn't really get to talk about this time, you know, winning and losing and stuff like that. We had a lot more to talk about. So I think we might push out to the next episode. I'll take some notes on what we didn't get to, and we might push this to a proposals part 2 on the next episode of the CRM Archaeology podcast. So with that, I think we'll say goodbye. Thanks, Heather, for all the fantastic information. Thanks, Doug, for the input, and we will see you guys next time. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.